Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, where I will be talking today about H.P. Lovecraft. Today is the triumphant return of Mythos Monday, which is something I used to do, like every Monday, for a long time when I first started my channel. I talked a lot about H.P. Lovecraft, one of my favorite writers, one of the writers I'm most interested in. I find H.P. Lovecraft and his work endlessly fascinating. And I've missed talking about H.P. Lovecraft, so Mythos Monday has returned. I probably won't do it every Monday. It'll probably be every other Monday or something. But you'll be seeing a lot more H.P. Lovecraft videos because I just find him very interesting. And for those of you who have inquired, yes, I will be talking also about Clark Ashton Smith in the near future, although I don't know exactly how I'm going to go about doing it, but I will be. And also Seabury Quinn. And some other writers who wrote in Weird Tales magazine. But for today, I have my dreaded copy of the Necronomicon, the best of H.P. Lovecraft. This is a good book as far as the contents are concerned. I will be revisiting H.P. Lovecraft towards the end of the year, probably November or December. I'll be rereading all of Lovecraft, which is something I haven't done for a long time. And once again, much like Conan, I'll be inviting folks to join me, although that's in the future. I will make that official announcement later. I won't be reading this volume, because first of all, this is not complete. And also, I believe that this volume has the uncorrected magazine texts. And I prefer to read the text that has been corrected by Joshi, S.T. Joshi, because there are some significant differences between the corrected and the uncorrected texts, particularly in certain stories, like At the Mountains of Madness. Otherwise, this is a great book as far as contents, if you have this. And it's well worth reading. I mean, it's H.P. Lovecraft. Today, I thought I would talk about H.P. Lovecraft and the way he used his fears and his anxieties and put those into his stories. When people talk about H.P. Lovecraft today, what seems to be the most prominent thing that people talk about or are concerned about is H.P. Lovecraft's racism. This comes up time and time again, so that all the focus is put onto that, or a lot of focus is put onto that. Of course, H.P. Lovecraft was writing 100 years ago, and a lot of people were pretty racist back then. H.P. Lovecraft grew up in a racist household, so these are attitudes and ideas that he just grew up with. And when you grow up with attitudes like that, you can shake them, but it can be difficult. And H.P. Lovecraft never actively tried to shake these attitudes that he grew up with. They were just part of his belief system. But we concern ourselves a lot with that with Lovecraft, more so than, say, Jack London, who was every bit as racist as H.P. Lovecraft was. But we don't concern ourselves with that with Jack London or some other writers at the time. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One of those is that people don't read Jack London that often. People do read him, but not very much compared to H.P. Lovecraft, who seems to be more relevant today for a lot of people. He's a much more popular writer nowadays. Wasn't always so, but nowadays that seems to be the case. And also the other reason is that he took those prejudices and he put them into his work in an unusual way, not the way that you would really expect. So racism in Lovecraft, it'll show up prominently in certain stories. He had a lot of prejudices, H.P. Lovecraft. He was a very xenophobic individual. Basically, he was afraid of many other people. anybody that was different or very different from the type of people that he grew up with, basically. So not just a particular race, but I mean, so many people he was he was prejudiced against. Italians, Italian immigrants, black people, Chinese people. I mean, everybody, basically, that wasn't just like the family he grew up in, the people that he felt comfortable with. And he was a bit reclusive, so not as much as people think, though. There's been this kind of mythology that's been built up about H.P. Lovecraft, about what a recluse he was and how weird he was. And he was odd and eccentric if you compare him to, the average person. Some of the things that he was interested in and, just some things about him. Yeah, but he also had a bunch of friends, and he was very sociable. And he traveled pretty widely on the East Coast and up into Canada. I mean, he wasn't a person that was just hiding, in his house writing weird stories. He got out, and he wrote thousands and thousands of letters to all sorts of people. And so he wasn't this weirdo, like I said, hiding in his house. He was out in the world, and he spent a lot of time with friends. Too much time. If you were unfortunate enough to be married to Lovecraft, his marriage didn't go very well. He was one of those fellows who just, maybe marriage was just a really bad idea. But he was a bit eccentric. He did have some odd ideas, and he recognized that he was different, and his interests were pretty specific. And his goals as far as his art was concerned. And he did consider his writing an art. He was only interested in the strange, in the unusual, and the weird. He had no interest in ordinary people or ordinary life. And he certainly was not interested in writing anything like that. And so he wrote weird stuff. And these prejudices that he had, like I said, he put them into his work in unusual ways. The stories we usually think of, I think, when we think of his prejudices and racism coming through in his stories, are stories like The Horror at Red Hook, He, and The Street. All of these are really bad stories. The Horror at Red Hook does have some interesting things about it, but it's not a great story. The Street is genuinely terrible. It could be H.P. Lovecraft's worst story, so it's one of those stories you probably haven't read. And his prejudices, his xenophobia, his racism, they do show up in those stories most prominently, but usually they show up in his horror stories, disguised in a way. He turns his fear of other people who are different, into monsters. And that was H.P. Lovecraft's theme for most of his work, most of his horror stories. He wrote about people who are haunted by monsters. And a lot of his anxieties and fears went into those stories, transformed into stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, a story where you don't have a particular race of people that is terrifying the main character in the story, but you do have a race of horrible monsters terrifying the main character in the story. And it's a great story. He's able to take these things that frightened him and put them in his stories in a way that can be genuinely disturbing and frightening, and creative and unusual. His work is fascinating in that way. And if he didn't have these unfortunate prejudices, his work would be very different. And it's not just of course, his prejudices that he puts into his work, but other things that he found frightening. The insignificance of human beings in the cosmos, for example, is the huge theme of Lovecraft. Much more than, his the xenophobic ideas that he had. And his attitudes changed over time as he wrote. He mellowed out a lot as he got older, as he moved into his 40s. When he was younger, he was so far to the right. I mean, he had an amateur paper called The Conservative. He was so conservative, and it's in his amateur work that you see some of his racist attitudes really come out. But his political attitudes and his social attitudes changed a lot because he lived during the Depression. And he started off when he was younger, growing up in a house that, they were really well off. I mean, they had money, his family, but they lost it all. And by the time Lovecraft was an adult, he was a guy who was very unsuited for normal employment. His experiences looking for a job in New York, for example, are just really sad. He just couldn't make it. And he had a tough time during the Depression because he was broke. I mean, he lived in poverty, Lovecraft did. And that experience changed his attitudes quite a bit. And so he went from being this super conservative guy to someone who became much more liberal and started to move into ideas like socialism, things like that. I mean, he's just completely changed by the time he got much older. And his other attitudes mellowed out quite a bit. And you see this actually in his fiction. He starts to relate more to the monsters that he's writing about. They become less terrifying in stories like At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time, for example, where he's actually relating to these monsters. And some of the creatures in At the Mountains of Madness, for example, he says straight up, they're horrible. He says they're alien creatures, but they're men. They're people. Which is kind of a startling thing if you compare it to his earlier work. I mean, At the Mountains of Madness reads quite differently. And The Shadow Out of Time only continues this. So when you read his work in the order that he wrote them, which is how most most complete collections of H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, that's how they are. They usually go in the order of composition. It's interesting to see how he changes stylistically, how he goes from stories, shorter supernatural stories, very much influenced by Edgar Allan Poe and later Lord Dunsany, and changing into a different kind of fiction. He moves into his Cthulhu mythos, which he never called that, and started writing science fiction horror stories. And you could see his attitudes changing if you know the events of his life and his social attitudes at the time. He was a very different person by the time he died. It would be interesting to know how his fiction would have changed if he had lived. But unfortunately, he got cancer and died young. He died in his 40s. But I find his work fascinating for all sorts of reasons. And that's one of them. How he uses his fears, his anxieties, his xenophobic ideas, his racism, and he puts all that into his fiction about horrific monsters, as well as, the insignificance of human beings. How he puts all that into his stories and creates this atmosphere of horror. And he creates a whole universe of horror. When you read his complete fiction, for example, all the stories all exist within the same horrific universe, as diverse as they are. I mean, he will reference characters and cities and things over and over again in his stories, and he'll reference other stories. And his stories are usually very, very different. I mean, he had his dream sequence of stories, his dream world stories, he had his Cthulhu mythos stories. He wrote a lot of different kinds of things. So all of that is fascinating, and I'll be talking about all of that in the future. But I will shut up now because I've gone on long enough. I will catch you next time.